Have you ever wondered what the most dangerous force in the world is? It's not a weapon, not a dictator, not even pure, calculated evil. On November 18th, 1978, in a remote jungle in Guyana, over 900 people, including men, women, and children, died in a single day. They weren't murdered by an invading army. They willingly drank cyanide-laced punch in what became known as the Jonestown massacre. A man named Jim Jones, using nothing but his words, convinced nearly 1,000 intelligent, capable people to end their own lives. And it forces you to ask the terrifying question, how does something like this happen? How do rational people become so blind, so obedient, that they walk willingly toward their own destruction? We love to believe that our intelligence is a shield, that being educated and aware protects us from falling into such obvious traps. But history tells a different story. Over and over again, the most catastrophic events haven't been shaped by evil, but by something far more common: stupidity. A German theologian and anti-Nazi resistance fighter named Dietrich Bonhoeffer realized this during one of humanity's darkest chapters. While the world blamed the horrors of Nazi Germany on pure evil, Bonhoeffer made a chilling observation. Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. But how? How could simple stupidity possibly be more dangerous than calculated evil? The answer is more unsettling than you can imagine. For all of human history, we've been trained to fear evil. We see it as the ultimate threat, malicious actors, deliberately trying to cause harm. But Bonhoeffer saw something far more insidious, something that can't be fought in the same way. According to Bonhoeffer, evil can, at least, be fought. You can expose it, you can reason against it, you can resist it. Evil has an agenda, a twisted logic. An evil person is aware of their actions. They make choices, they understand consequences. This means, in theory, you can stop them with intelligence, with moral strength, with resistance. Stupidity, however, is a completely different beast. It's immune to logic. You can't debate with it. You can't reason with it. It doesn't want to cause destruction on purpose, but destruction is its natural outcome. A person acting out of stupidity is infinitely more dangerous than one acting out of malice. Because while evil has its limits, stupidity has none. It is boundless, self-fueling, and worst of all, it can thrive completely unopposed. Now, it's easy to mix up stupidity with ignorance, but Bonhoeffer drew a critical line in the sand. Ignorance is just a lack of knowledge. It means someone hasn't been exposed to certain facts. And the key thing about ignorance is, it can be fixed. You can teach an ignorant person. You can show them the truth, and they have the capacity to learn and change. Stupidity, on the other hand, is an active resistance to learning. A stupid person doesn't just lack information, they actively reject it. They refuse to accept new facts, especially when those facts are undeniable. They ignore logic, dismiss reason, and cling to their beliefs no matter how much evidence proves them wrong. This is what makes it so incredibly dangerous. It feeds on itself. The deeper someone falls into stupidity, the harder it is to pull them out. They double down on their false beliefs, surrounding themselves with others who think the same way, reinforcing their shared delusion. They label any contradicting information as fake news or propaganda. They don't seek truth, they seek comfort. This makes them completely unreachable by logic. And this resistance to reason has shaped some of history's greatest disasters. Time and again, leaders have made catastrophic decisions, not because they were unintelligent, but because they simply refused to accept reality. Look at the NASA Challenger disaster in 1986. The space shuttle was scheduled to launch on a freezing January morning. Multiple engineers gave stark warnings that the O-rings, critical components, were never designed to work in such cold temperatures. The evidence was clear. The warnings were loud, but the people in charge refused to listen. They dismissed the concerns, absolutely convinced that the launch had to go ahead as planned. The result? 73 seconds after liftoff, the Challenger exploded in mid-air, killing all 7 astronauts on board. This wasn't ignorance. The engineers knew the facts. It was stupidity, a flat-out refusal to acknowledge inconvenient truths. History is littered with these moments. Politicians ignoring intelligence reports, generals marching into battles they can't win, corporations dismissing expert warnings, all driven by arrogance, overconfidence, and a stubborn refusal to admit they might be wrong. Bonhoeffer also saw another terrifying part of stupidity. It's not just a personal flaw, it's a social disease. Stupidity thrives in groups. It spreads like a virus, infecting people who might otherwise be perfectly rational. The bigger the group, the less likely individuals are to think for themselves. This is the secret behind propaganda. It's why mobs form. It's why history seems to be stuck on a loop. When people join a collective, they start outsourcing their thinking to the group. They stop questioning. They stop analyzing. And they just go with the flow. And as Bonhoeffer warned, the moment you stop thinking for yourself, you cease to be an individual. You become a vessel for stupidity. That's why the most devastating events in history didn't happen because of a few evil masterminds. They happened because huge numbers of ordinary people refused to question authority, refused to think critically, and refused to take responsibility for their own actions. Perhaps the most disturbing part of Bonhoeffer's theory is this: stupidity is immune to correction. If someone is truly in its grip, no amount of evidence, no amount of reasoning, no amount of debate will ever change their mind. They don't just lack information, they reject it. This is why fighting stupidity is so incredibly frustrating. You can't argue with someone who has chosen to ignore reality. And that is what makes stupidity, in Bonhoeffer's view, the greatest threat to humanity. Not war, not crime, not even organized evil. It's the silent, invisible force that drives nations into ruin, that allows propaganda to spread like wildfire, and that turns ordinary people into instruments of destruction. It's a force we can't afford to ignore, because unlike evil, stupidity doesn't need a plan or a motive. It just needs to exist. And that's enough to destroy everything we hold dear. We often think of stupidity as an individual flaw, but Bonhoeffer saw it as a collective force, a virus infecting entire societies. A single foolish person might make a bad choice, but when stupidity becomes widespread, reinforced by social pressure, blind obedience, and propaganda, it turns into something far more dangerous. It becomes a social disease that can decide the fate of nations. Stupidity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It thrives in groups. The moment people stop thinking for themselves and start relying on the collective, they become vulnerable to its influence. This is why it's so contagious. It passes from person to person until it dominates an entire society. Bonhoeffer argued that when people are in large groups, they surrender their individual judgment. They stop questioning. They stop analyzing. They just follow the crowd, assuming that if everyone else believes something, it must be true. This is the foundation of groupthink, a psychological phenomenon where people conform to the dominant belief, even when that belief is obviously wrong. And once groupthink takes hold, stupidity spreads like wildfire, creating a feedback loop where one person's foolishness is reinforced by another's, until questioning the group becomes unthinkable. This is how blind obedience is born, and it's through that obedience that history's greatest horrors have been unleashed. Dictators and authoritarians have always understood this one simple truth: stupidity is a weapon. They know that a society of critical thinkers is hard to control, but a society that doesn't question, a society that blindly obeys, that is a dictator's greatest ally. Adolf Hitler didn't need a whole country of evil people to carry out the horrors of Nazi Germany. He just needed a population that was too blind, too obedient, and too unwilling to think for themselves. The Nazi regime thrived not because Germans were inherently cruel, but because propaganda turned them into unthinking followers. The Nazis used mass rallies, emotional speeches, and a tightly controlled media to hammer home one simple message: don't question, don't think, just follow. And millions of people did just that. Even those who had private doubts were too scared to go against the majority. And so, they stayed silent, allowing evil to spread. To understand just how easily people fall into this trap, psychologists have conducted experiments that reveal a terrifying truth. Most of us will obey authority and conform to the group, even when we know it's wrong. One of the most famous is the Milgram experiment. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram had participants administer what they thought were electric shocks to a person in another room. The shocks were fake, but the participants didn't know that. They heard screams, pleas for mercy, and then a dead silence suggesting the person had passed out. And yet, most participants kept pressing the button, delivering what they believed were lethal shocks, simply because a man in a lab coat told them to. This proved that ordinary people will commit horrific acts, not because they're evil, but because they're blindly following orders. Another psychologist, Milgram and Asch, revealed something just as disturbing. In his conformity experiment, a participant was put in a room with a group of actors. They were shown a line and asked to match its length to one of 3 other lines. The answer was incredibly obvious, but the actors were all told to give the same, clearly wrong answer. Over 75% of the time, the real participant went along with the group and gave the wrong answer too, just to avoid standing out. These experiments show how easily we abandon our own judgment to fit in. Once that happens, stupidity spreads uncontrollably. It's the reason authoritarian regimes rise, why propaganda works, and why misinformation goes viral. And the scariest part, stupidity thrives when good people do nothing to fight it. This is why Bonhoeffer believed it is our moral duty to resist stupidity wherever we find it, by awakening our own ability to think. We often think of stupidity as a trait of the weak or the uneducated. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer pointed out something far more unsettling. Stupidity thrives in power. The more authority a person has, the more likely they are to become completely blind to their own ignorance. We assume that powerful people, world leaders, CEOs, top officials, must be brilliant. But history shows, again and again, that power doesn't just corrupt. It makes people foolish. So why does this happen? Why do smart people often make catastrophically stupid decisions once they get a taste of power? The biggest danger of power is that it isolates you from reality. The higher you climb, the more you're surrounded by yes men, advisors and subordinates who, out of fear or loyalty, only tell you what you want to hear. You become trapped in an echo chamber of your own making. Powerful people start to believe their own hype. Past successes convince them they are infallible, so they dismiss warnings and criticism. They also become disconnected from the real-world consequences of their actions. If a CEO makes a bad call, employees lose their jobs. If a politician creates a disastrous policy, it's the public that suffers. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Power breeds arrogance. Arrogance blinds you to stupidity, and the cycle continues, unchallenged. History is full of corporate leaders whose overconfidence drove their companies right off a cliff. Think about the 2008 financial crisis. For years, experts warned that the housing market was a massive, unstable bubble, but the executives at the biggest banks ignored them. Why? They thought they were too big and too powerful to fail. They convinced themselves the risks weren't real, silencing anyone who disagreed, until the entire global economy came crashing down. Perhaps the most infamous example of power-induced stupidity is the Chernobyl disaster. The engineers at the plant knew the risks of the tests they were running, but the Soviet leadership, obsessed with proving their technological superiority, dismissed every single concern. On the night of the disaster, as alarms blared, the supervisors refused to acknowledge the danger. They overrode safety protocols, insisting the experiment continue. The result was an explosion that released 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. This wasn't just a technological failure, it was a human one. It was the direct result of power making people blind to reality. Psychologists have found that power literally changes how our brains work. It makes us overconfident, it reduces our empathy, and it encourages recklessness. Is there any way to break this cycle? The only solution is intellectual humility. The greatest leaders are the ones who surround themselves with people who challenge them, not just agree with them. They stay open to criticism and are willing to admit when they're wrong. But these traits are rare, and that is why stupidity continues to thrive at the highest levels of society, and why Bonhoeffer's warning is more relevant than ever. Stupidity is not just an individual flaw, it's a contagious social force. And in today's world, where misinformation travels faster than truth, it has become more dangerous than at any point in history. In the past, stupidity spread through word of mouth or state propaganda. Today it has a super spreader, social media. Studies show that a lie on social media spreads 6 times faster than a factual correction. Why? Because lies are often more exciting, more shocking, and more emotionally charged than the boring truth. We don't share information because it's accurate. We share it because it confirms our biases, fuels our outrage, or makes us feel like part of a group. And once that misinformation takes root, it's almost impossible to correct. People would rather double down than admit they were wrong. History is filled with conspiracy theories that people blindly accepted, no matter how absurd. From the belief that the earth is flat to the denial of scientifically proven facts. Stupidity thrives when people reject critical thinking for easy answers. Look at the anti-vaccine movement. Despite overwhelming scientific consensus, millions believe vaccines are harmful. This belief spread not through facts, but through fear, social pressure, and targeted misinformation. This pattern repeats over and over. The more people who accept a false belief, the harder it is to challenge. Soon, entire societies are driven by irrationality, making decisions that harm everyone. This is how propaganda works. It tricks the masses into ignoring reality. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt called it, this is the banality of evil. The idea that history's greatest atrocities weren't carried out by monsters, but by normal people who just followed orders without thinking. This isn't just history. It's happening right now. Propaganda shapes our political beliefs, fuels division, and makes us blindly follow leaders. Bonhoeffer's warning is crystal clear. Stupidity spreads when people stop thinking for themselves. The only way to break the cycle is to constantly question what we're told, challenge popular opinion, and seek the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. If stupidity is so deeply woven into our society, spreading through misinformation, reinforced by power, and fueled by our own desire to conform, is there any escape? Or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes forever? Dietrich Bonhoeffer believed that while stupidity is a powerful force, it is not inevitable. He saw it not just as an intellectual failure, but as a moral one. People choose stupidity because it's easier. It's easier to follow the crowd than to think for yourself. It's easier to obey than to question. It's easier to believe a comforting lie than to face an uncomfortable truth. But Bonhoeffer believed we can resist. Breaking free requires a conscious, deliberate choice to think critically, to challenge authority, and then to expose ourselves to ideas that make us uneasy. The first step is to train your mind to question everything. This doesn't mean being a cynic. It means being an active thinker. When you hear a claim, ask yourself, who benefits from me believing this? Is there actual evidence for this? Or am I just accepting it because others are? Look for contradictions. If a belief requires you to ignore inconvenient facts, it's time to question that belief. Learn to recognize when your emotions, fear, anger, loyalty, are being used to manipulate you. One of the main reasons stupidity spreads is because we trap ourselves in echo chambers. only listening to voices that confirm what we already believe. To escape, you have to break out, deliberately read opposing views, engage in conversations with people who challenge you, not just those who agree with you. A smart person welcomes debate. A stupid person runs from it. Detox your social media feed. If you only hear one side of the story, you're not thinking. You're just repeating. One of Bonhoeffer's most haunting realizations was that stupid people don't see themselves as responsible. They say, "I was just following orders," or "everyone else was doing it." This is how the worst things in history happen. So, you must take responsibility for your own beliefs. Authority should always be questioned. Just because someone is in power doesn't make them right. Real intelligence isn't about knowing more facts. It's about having the courage to think for yourself. History's greatest tragedies weren't just caused by evil men. They were enabled by ordinary people who refused to think. People who followed orders, accepted lies, and stayed silent. We like to tell ourselves that if we had lived back then, in Nazi Germany or under some other regime, we would have resisted. We would have seen the truth. But would we? Or would we, like so many others, have just gone along with the crowd? Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't about the past. It was about right now. Look around. People still blindly follow political leaders, still fall for absurd conspiracy theories, still reject evidence that contradicts their feelings. The tools have changed. It's social media algorithms and viral headlines instead of government newspapers. But the result is the same. People are thinking less and obeying more. And the more stupidity spreads, the harder it becomes to resist. The most dangerous people in history weren't necessarily evil. They were just too stupid to realize what they were a part of. They never paused to ask themselves, am I being manipulated? Am I blindly following an order that's wrong? Am I contributing to something terrible? This is why Bonhoeffer feared stupidity more than evil. Evil needs a plan. Stupidity needs nothing but your unquestioning compliance. If stupidity is the greatest danger, then the most powerful act of resistance you can perform is to simply think. Think before you believe. Think before you share. Think before you follow. Because the moment you stop thinking for yourself, someone else will be more than happy to do it for you. So I'll leave you with a final challenge. Will you be a thinker, or will you be a follower? The next time you see a popular opinion or a viral story, just pause. Ask yourself, am I just accepting this, or have I actually thought about it? Am I being a thinker, or am I just another follower? Because stupidity never announces itself. It just spreads, quietly, until one day you wake up and realize history has repeated itself all over again.